From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
In fact, there are two members of Congress, Republican and Democrat, right now, who have been subject to review, or not have been subject to review, but have engaged in sexual harassment.
What happens to a Congress member when someone dares to come forward to report them for sexual assault or harassment? Victims have 180 days. They face up to 30 days of mandatory counseling, a cooling-off period, before they decide to file a claim. Only the congressman's lawyer is paid for by taxpayers. We'll speak with an attorney who's represented multiple congressional staffers pursuing harassment claims. Then 75 years in prison. That's what more than 200 people face as they go on trial for protesting on J20. That's January 20th, Trump's inauguration day.
I peacefully marched down the street, attempting to catch up with a group of other demonstrators. Although I did not engage in any acts of vandalism, the next thing I knew, police were firing pepper spray and tear gas everywhere. They never warned us or told us to disperse.
We'll speak with one of the defendants and get an update on the trial. Then, floating Guantanamos.
Coast Guard has been operating deep into the Pacific Ocean, interdicting cocaine and detaining suspected drug smugglers aboard their cutters, often for weeks or months, in what one former Coast Guard official called floating Guantanamos on the Pacific.
We'll speak with a reporter who broke the story in the New York Times and links the thousands of detentions to General John Kelly, President Trump's chief of staff, while he was head of Southcom. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's heading to Capitol Hill today to promote his proposed tax plan, which would shower billions of dollars of tax cuts on the wealthiest Americans, including President Trump's own family. The Congressional Budget Office says the Senate's version of the tax bill would hurt people making less than $30,000 a year, while giving major tax cuts to those making more than $100,000 a year. A provision of the Senate bill would also eliminate a key part of the Affordable Care Act, the requirement that Americans have health insurance or pay a penalty. As Republicans scramble for enough votes to pass the plan, they are considering tacking on even more tax breaks for wealthy business owners. The Senate Budget Committee slated to vote on the bill today, and lawmakers are pressing for a vote in the full Senate this week. The showdown at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau continued Monday as two dueling leaders, one named by President Trump, one named by the agency's former head, both battled for control. The chaos began Friday when former Director Richard Cordray resigned and appointed his former Chief of Staff, Leandra English, to be his successor. But then President Trump appointed his Budget Director, Mick Mulvaney, to head the agency. While serving as a South Carolina congressman, Mulvaney voted to eliminate the agency entirely. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. On Monday morning, Trump's budget director, Mick Mulvaney, arrived at the CFPB with a bag of donuts and sent an email telling the agency staff to disregard all orders from English. He also said he was freezing all hiring and all rulemaking. Leandra English, meanwhile, also showed up to the office on Monday, welcomed the staff back from vacation, then met with lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Later in the day, English and Mulvaney appeared before a federal judge, arguing each was the true head of the agency. The judge, a recent Trump appointee, refused to rule immediately, meaning the showdown continues into today. In the midst of the battle at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, President Trump attempted to insult Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of the agency's principal architects, by referring to her as Pocahontas. Trump did this during a White House ceremony honoring Navajo code talkers, Native Americans who served in the Marines during World War II and used the Navajo language in order to transmit encoded information.
I just want to thank you because you're very, very special people. You were here long before any of us were here. Although we have a representative in Congress, who they say was here a long time ago. They call her Pocahontas. But you know what? I like you because you are special. You are special people.
President Trump has frequently attacked Senator Warren by calling her Pocahontas. Warren says her family is part Cherokee. Trump held the ceremony honoring the Navajo military veterans in front of a portrait of former President Andrew Jackson, who was called Indian Killer by the Cherokees. Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, leading to the forced displacement and deaths of tens of thousands of Native Americans, a march that became known as the Trail of Tears. This is Senator Elizabeth Warren speaking later Monday.
Had to throw out a racial slur. He seems to think that if he keeps doing that, somehow he's going to shut me up. It hadn't worked in the past. It's not going to work in the future. And whether he likes it or not, I'm going to be out there, and I'm going to keep talking about what he's trying to do to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Yet another top official at the State Department has resigned. Malice Beams was serving as a special advisor to Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. She was overseeing Tillerson's reorganization or downsizing of the State Department, but served only 3 months before quitting the State Department this week. More than 100 officials and career diplomats have left the State Department since President Trump took office. Progressive Illinois Democratic Congressmember Luis Gutierrez is slated to announce today he's retiring from Congress. He's a member of the Judiciary Committee and co-chair of the Immigration Task Force of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. He's been a longtime pro-immigration advocate, arrested multiple times at protests against deportations. He's also been a fierce critic of President Trump. The Washington Post reports it appears to have been targeted for an undercover sting operation by a right-wing organization seeking to discredit the Washington Post reporting on multiple allegations of sexual assault and harassment by Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore. Moore has been accused of sexually harassing or assaulting at least 9 women when they were children or teenagers. The Post reports a separate woman approached the Washington Post with a dramatic but invented story about Roy Moore impregnating her as a teenager. The Post says it conducted a series of interviews with the woman in which the reporters found inconsistencies in her story. Then on Monday, the reporters saw her walk into the New York headquarters of Project Veritas, a right-wing group that often sets up sting operations targeting the media and journalists by recording covert videos. Project Veritas's founder, James O'Keefe, refused to answer the Washington Post questions about whether he was working with Roy Moore's campaign or other Republican strategists in order to discredit media reporting on Roy Moore. On Monday, Moore spoke publicly for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, once again claiming he did not know any of the women who've accused him. Meanwhile, one of Moore's campaign coordinators physically attacked a cameraman outside a campaign rally in Alabama on Monday night before Moore arrived. This all comes as President Trump is now attempting to claim that the infamous 2005 Access Hollywood tape in which he brags about sexually assaulting women is fake. This is a clip of the tape.
Yeah, that's it, with the gold. I gotta use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. Do anything.
After the tape first resurfaced during the 2016 presidential election, President Trump did not dispute the tape's authenticity, but instead said his words were locker room talk. But now he's claiming the tape is fake. This is Access Hollywood host Natalie Morales responding to the news reports about Trump's claims Monday.
We wanted to clear something up that has been reported across the media landscape. According to the New York Times, President Trump told 2 people that the Access Hollywood bus tape, the one where he bragged about grabbing women by the you-know-what, is fake. Let us make this perfectly clear. The tape is very real.
We'll have more on sexual harassment, the media, and Congress after headlines. In more news from Washington, D.C., former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn met with special counsel Robert Mueller's team on Monday. Mueller's investigating possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia during the 2016 election. Flynn's meeting Monday is the latest indication Flynn may be close to accepting a plea deal, which would see him likely testify against President Trump or members of Trump's inner circle. The U.S. Navy has identified 3 sailors who went missing after their plane crashed in the Philippine Sea southeast of Okinawa, Japan, on Wednesday. The Navy called off its search and rescue mission Thursday. The sailors were Stephen Combs, Matthew Chalastri, and Brian Grosso. In Honduras, progressive candidate Salvador Nasralla has declared victory as he continues to hold an unexpected lead in Sunday's election results. His challenger, President Juan Orlando Hernández, had been widely expected to win despite increasing concerns about the conservative president's authoritarianism and consolidation of power. But by Monday evening, Nasralla was heading Hernández by 5% of the vote, with nearly 6% counted. This is Nasralla.
As you all know, this has already been won. Don't be swayed, please, by what some media are saying. What has happened is that we have broken the regular plan, by which, for the first time, it was the people who voted for their president. This was the people's choice.
60% of the vote has been counted in Honduras. In Indonesia, 150,000 people are under evacuation orders on the island of Bali as the Mount Agung volcano has begun erupting. The island's main airport has been shut down because of ashfall. The last time Mount Agung erupted, in 1963, more than 1,000 people died and several villages were destroyed. In Vietnam, a 22-year-old blogger has been sentenced to 7 years in prison for reporting on a chemical spill that contaminated a 120-mile stretch of central Vietnam's coastline last year. Nguyen Van Hoa was convicted of spreading anti-state propaganda by reporting on the protests after the spill, which was one of the worst environmental disasters in Vietnam's recent history. In Australia, 6 peace activists have been convicted of trespassing at a top-secret U.S. military base hidden in the Australian outback in a protest last year. The peace activists now face up to 7 years in prison. The trials have put a spotlight on the secretive military base known as the Joint Defense Facility Pine Gap, from which the U.S. gathers satellite information used to launch U.S. airstrikes around the world. And in an update to a Democracy Now! Story last week, California Congressman Ted Lieu has sent a letter to Secretary of Defense James Mattis demanding the Pentagon respond to a New York Times expose that revealed the U.S. military has killed many more civilians during its war on ISIS than the Pentagon has admitted. In an expose entitled The Uncounted, journalists Asmat Khan and Anand Gopal reveal in the New York Times Magazine the U.S. is killing civilians in up to 1 in every 5 airstrikes, a figure 31 times higher than the Pentagon admits. In his letter, Congressman Lieu demanded the Pentagon investigate the Times reports of civilian casualties, writing, quote, "If the findings are accurate, the coalition's conduct not only may violate the law of armed conflict, it may also help ISIS in recruiting efforts," unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show looking at sexual harassment in Washington and what happens to a member of Congress when someone dares to come forward to report wrongdoing. On Monday, Senator Al Franken returned to Congress in the face of allegations from 4 women now that he had groped or inappropriately touched them. Franken, a contrite Franken, vowed this will not happen again.
I just want to say a few words before I get back to work. I know that I've let a lot of people down, people of Minnesota, my colleagues, my staff, my supporters, and everyone who has counted on me to be a champion for women. To all of you, I just want to again say I am sorry. I know there are no magic words that I can say to regain your trust, and I know that's going to take time.
Meanwhile, on Monday, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said she spoke to and believed one of the women who has accused Michigan Congressman John Conyers of sexual harassment. Conyers reportedly settled a harassment complaint in 2015, paying out $27,000 to a woman who alleged she was fired from his Washington staff because she rejected his sexual advances. Conyers has since stepped down as the top Democrat in the House Judiciary Committee. Pelosi issued a statement saying, quote, "This afternoon, I spoke with Melanie Sloan, who worked for Congressman Conyers on the Judiciary Committee in the mid-1990s. Ms. Sloan told me that she had publicly discussed distressing experiences while on his staff. I find the behavior Ms. Sloan described unacceptable and disappointing, and I believe what Ms. Sloan has told me."
Pelosi went on to criticize the process for reporting sexual harassment in Congress, saying, quote, "I have not had the opportunity to speak with the other women, one of whom cannot speak publicly because of the secretive settlement process in place. That ridiculous system must be ended, and victims who want to come forward to the Ethics Committee must be able to do so," Pelosi said. This came one day after Congressmember Pelosi called Congressman Conyers an icon who deserves due process during an interview on NBC's Meet the Press.
We are strengthened by due process. Just because someone is accused, and was it one accusation? Is it two? I think there has to be. John Conyers is an icon in our country. He has done a great deal to protect women, Violence Against Women Act, which the right wing is now quoting me as praising him for his work on that, and he did great work on that.
So Congresswoman Pelosi has called for due process for her colleague, Congressman Conyers, and also called the process for reporting sexual harassment in Congress a ridiculous system that must be ended. That system gives sexual harassment victims in Congress 180 days to bring a claim to the Congressional Office of Compliance, which handles workplace complaints. Victims are then subject to up to 30 days of mandatory counseling. They then have a cooling-off period to decide whether to bring claims to mediation. If they don't want mediation, they're out of options. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Alexis Roenicker, an attorney with the firm Katz, Marshall & Banks, who's represented multiple congressional staffers pursuing harassment claims through Congress's Office of Compliance. Welcome to Democracy Now! Let's start by you laying out, Alexis, the process which is being disputed now. Legislation is being written to change it. The process a person has to go through who works on the Hill to bring a charge of sexual harassment or sexual assault against a Congress member.
Absolutely. A staff member who finds themselves in a situation where they're facing sexual harassment, even sexual assault, the process for pursuing a claim would be within 180 days, as you said. They would need to go to the Office of Compliance, which is a small agency that's part of the legislative branch, and file what's called a request for counseling. Counseling is somewhat of a misnomer. It's more of an intake process. That counseling period is 30 days, and by statute, it is strictly confidential. Then the staff member, should they choose to proceed and want to continue with their claim, they file a request for mediation. The mediation period is 30 days, and it is mandatory. That means that a staff member, even if they would know that they want to go to court, has to participate in this mandatory mediation in which they have to, in good faith, they have to sign an agreement that says in good faith they're going to attempt to resolve this dispute with the employing office. If that mediation period...
Are they mediating with the congressman at that point?
The civil action is not against the congressperson, it's against the office. There is actually no way to bring a claim directly against the congress member who is harassing the staffer. So they are actually mediating against with the office. Now, whether the office chooses to bring the harasser, whether it be a congressperson or a chief of staff, that is actually up to the office, not up to the person who is bringing the claim.
Well, last week, Democratic Congresswoman Diane DeGette of Colorado told MSNBC she's among many women who've been sexually harassed while serving in Congress. This is what she said.
A lot of my colleagues and others have said this is going on, but they seem somehow still reluctant to say who did it. Some years ago, I was in an elevator, And then Congressman Bob Filner tried to pin me to the door of the elevator and kiss me, and I pushed him away. And of course, some years later, he left Congress. He became the mayor of San Diego, and then he had to leave that position for harassing younger women.
An aide to Representative DeGette told the Denver Post she did not file a complaint or take official action in the incident she described. Do you have any sense of how often people do not actually file complaints, even though they were subjected to harassment?
So there's no numbers on Congress per se, except that there was a survey that was conducted, I believe, by roll call, in which 1 of 6 women said that they had been sexually harassed. But we saw by the numbers publicized by the Office of Compliance that in 2016, only 8 Senate and House staffers came forward with any requests for counseling about anything. We don't know how many of those are harassment. But just the dichotomy in those 2 sets of numbers show that most are not coming forward.
And could you indicate to us how different is the process that Congress uses compared to private industry or even other local, state, and city governments?
The most significant difference between the process that Congress has created for itself and private and federal is the confidentiality requirement through the counseling and mediation period, which isolates the victims of sexual harassment, and also this mandatory mediation, which forces a victim or a person who's been sexually harassed to sit down at the table and attempt to resolve a dispute, even if they would like to move forward.
Now, let's be clear. At the moment of mediation, both sides can have a lawyer. Who pays for these lawyers?
So yes, both sides can have a lawyer. The office's attorney is paid for as part of the administrative costs of the House or the Senate. They have their own in-house employment lawyers. For the victim, they have to procure their own attorney and figure out a way to pay for that.
So the congressman has taxpayer lawyer, funded lawyer, and the plaintiff has to get her own lawyer.
Absolutely.
So explain what this non-disclosure agreement is in this period at the beginning, and how many days does it go on for? Can the person tell, contemporaneously, when it happens, people? Can they tell their therapist, et cetera?
So, yes, let's break this down. There's a non-disclosure agreement that is agreed to as part of the settlement process. But the actual whole process of counseling and mediation has to be strictly confidential by statute. That being said, a person who has been sexually harassed can always, there's nothing preventing them from being public about what's happened to them. What they can't speak about is pursuing legal action while they're going through this counseling and mediation stage. I do think that that's important because that's very isolating for the person, but it also prevents them from telling other people that they're moving forward, encouraging other people to move forward with them, and it prevents, multiple people coming forward, and also the person just being able to verify that not only am I saying that this happened, but I am taking action.
Now, we've seen these reports of the $17 million figure of settlements on Capitol Hill, but that doesn't just deal with sexual harassment complaints, right? It could also be other types of complaints, and it doesn't necessarily deal with members of Congress per se. It could also mean Capitol Hill staffers. Can you talk about that as well?
Sure. The vast majority of those, just based on the numbers put out by the Office of Compliance, are requests for counseling involving Capitol Police, the employees for the Office of the Architect of the Capitol. Very few of those are congressional staffers from the House and the Senate. And there is no, at this point, the Office of Compliance has not broken down whether they're for discrimination, whether they're for harassment, or whether they're for workplace issues such as OSHA, which is occupational safety, or disability accommodation. So right now we have no way of knowing what portion of those complaints or requests for counseling and what portion of that settlement is for harassment. But in my experience, the number that was put forward with Representative Conyers, the case involving Representative Conyers, which was a little under 28,000, is much more indicative of the settlement range than, 17 million.
Now, Alexis, can you actually talk about the case of Conyers? A lot is being made of the fact he paid it out of his office budget, $27,000, as opposed to what? I mean, both are taxpayer-funded, both his office budget and this office that the vast majority of people don't know about where the $17 million came out of, right? But also, if you can talk overall about this case, your response to the wrongful dismissal complaint in 2015 with a former employee who alleged she was fired when she didn't accept Congressman Conyers' sexual advances.
Absolutely. This case is very concerning. I can tell you, as an employment lawyer who represents people both in the private sector and congressional staffers, that being able to come forward with 14 affidavits from witnesses that corroborate what you say and witnesses who work there is relatively rare. People are not usually willing to risk their jobs and careers to do this. And so the fact that this complainant was able to do that, and then the result of that was a settlement of 3-month severance, is a travesty, really, and it shows the environment that women who are, coming forward with sexual harassment claims on the Hill endure, which is it's your career on the line, and no one believes you, and if you decide to go public, it's going to affect your career more than the person who harassed you. And so that's just very troubling. But to speak about what the dichotomy of whether it comes from the members' allowance or the fund that was set up by Congress, I think that too much is being made about taxpayer dollars being used for this. Quite frankly, taxpayer dollars are used for sexual harassment claims that are settled on the executive branch side at the Department of Interior, Homeland Security. That is how employees who have been discriminated against in the federal workforce, that is how their settlements are paid. I think what's critical in this circumstance is that these settlements require strict confidentiality, that that the statute outlines a way that they're supposed to be paid, which is through this special fund, but members have gone around that, and because to access that fund, you have to go through several steps, which would disseminate the information that they've been accused of sexual harassment. So members have now gone around that and have used their member allowance, which after carefully reviewing the statute, I believe is contrary to the statute.
Well, and also this issue of when these settlements are done in secret, that other women on the Hill have no knowledge of the history of some of these legislators that they are working around or for.
Absolutely. And then, like we said, and there's a strict confidentiality of the process, so they can't even know that women have pursued claims, let alone that there's been a settlement. And, I think that that's important. People come, young women and also men, some men are sexually harassed as well. They come to the Hill, they're often very young, they're bright-eyed, they want to be making a change and affecting policy, and then they find themselves in an environment where they're being abused and harassed, and there's no place to turn to. And, had there been any public light as to prior instances of sexual harassment, they would be able to know not to go to those positions.
Well, a bipartisan resolution was introduced Friday in the House that would require all members, congressional staff, interns, and fellows to receive anti-harassment, anti-discrimination training. The Washington Post reports, quote, each member and employee would receive training within the first 90 days of each session of Congress or within 90 days of becoming a member or an employee. Each member office would be required to display a poster created by the Office of Compliance that outlines employees' legal rights and protections and how they can report allegations of workplace violations. So, Alexis Roniker, do you think this is what needs to happen? There is also legislation that is changing the law as it's in place. It went into place in 1995. And if you can talk about that and what you feel needs to be changed.
Absolutely. This member training and poster Band-Aid is not going to change things. You know, if you look there, for the last 20 years, private employers have used training and, you know, notifying employees how to report, and it hasn't reduced sexual harassment. And it's certainly not going to do that on the Hill. Is it a good step? It's certainly good to notify people of how to move forward. Yes, that is a good step, but that is the very smallest of steps. What really needs to happen is the legislation that Representative Spears and Representative Comstock and Senator Gillibrand have introduced, the Me Too Congress bill that will revise the process. You know, it gets rid of the requirements of someone having to go through the counseling and the mandatory mediation. It gets rid of the required confidentiality. It makes any settlement that it doesn't, the harassed person doesn't have to sign a confidentiality agreement if they don't want to. I mean, it really takes care of a lot of the systemic hurdles of the law. It's not going to change the overwhelming environmental problems that create such a hospitable environment for sexual harassment, but it certainly at least gets rid of some of the legal hurdles to remedying those when it happens.
And it names the Congress member?
Pardon, say that again?
It allows for the naming of Congress members.
Yes, my understanding of the legislation is it would allow the person who is sexually harassed to be public about it, even if they settle their matter.
And if you want to just find out what Congress members have had to pay out money or have been charged, can you find that out as a member of the public?
I believe that it starts at the beginning of this year. This is a point that lawmakers are still debating, and I have to say, as I'm concerned about, I've represented prior staffers, and part of the reason they resolved their claims was because they didn't want to be in the public eye. These offices are very small, and it is a concern for these individuals that once information comes out, that they will quickly be identified. And so going forward, if someone knows that, I think that it absolutely is the right way to go. But I do have concerns about retroactively having that happen.
Well, I mean, you can name the person who's been, where this agreement has been made, the Congress member, without naming ever the person who made the claim.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Alexis Roniker, we want to thank you for being with us, lawyer with Katz, Marshall, and Banks, who has represented a number of congressional staffers pursuing harassment claims through the Congress's Office of Compliance. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, hundreds of people are facing up to 75 years in jail for protesting on J20, January 20th, Trump's inauguration day. We'll talk to one of the defendants and with a lawyer. Stay with us.
I see somebody marching. They're marching down the street. Yeah. I see somebody marching. They're marching down the street. Oh, yes, they are. This time we stop and pray. We pray, oh, Lord, to have a better day. Yeah. I see somebody marching down the street. Oh, yes, they are. I hear somebody cry.
Crying in the streets, Muslim Indian American singer Zishan B. singing here in our Democracy Now! Studios. To see his full performance and interview, go to DemocracyNow.org. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to the first trial of the nearly 200 people arrested during President Trump's inauguration. The trial began November 15th in Washington, D.C., and involved 6 people, including one journalist, Alexei Wood, a freelance photojournalist and videographer based in San Antonio. The defendants were charged under the federal riot statute and faced multiple felony and misdemeanor charges, including inciting or urging to riot, conspiracy to riot, and multiple counts of destruction of property. Evidence against the defendants has been scant from the moment of their arrest. As demonstrators, journalists, and observers gathered in Northwest D.C. after the January 20th inauguration, some separated from the group and broke windows of nearby businesses and damaged cars. Police officers then swept hundreds of people in the vicinity into a blockaded corner in a process known as kettling, where they carried out mass arrests of everyone in the area.
Officials seized Trump protesters' cell phones, cracked their passwords, attempted to use the contents to convict them of conspiracy to riot. Court filings reveal that investigators have been able to crack into at least 8 defendants' locked cell phones. Prosecutors want to use the internet history, communications, pictures they extracted from the phones as evidence against the defendants in court. The American Civil Liberties Union has filed a lawsuit which charges D.C. police mistreated detainees, including sexual abuse as a form of punishment. A complaint by 4 plaintiffs charges officers used excessive force, denied detainees food, water, and access to toilets. The D.C. Police Department has defended its officers' actions, saying all arrests on January 20th were proper. Well, for more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by 2 guests. Jude Ortiz is a member of the organizing crew of Defend J20 and the Mass Defense Committee chair for the National Lawyers Guild. He's a lawyer. Elizabeth Legesse is a defendant in the criminal case against participants in the Inauguration Day protests, a plaintiff in the ACLU lawsuit against the city of Washington, D.C. and the police department. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Jude, let's begin with you. The trial has been going on for a week now. Can you explain exactly what's been happening and what these first set of defendants are charged with, what they face?
Yes, good morning. Just to clarify, I'm a legal worker, so legal support activist, but not a lawyer. However, I have been in court since the beginning of the trial. So far, with the 6 defendants who are on trial, the state has opened its case, including witnesses from the police, and there's a helicopter pilot for the Department of Homeland Security, and different managers or employees of businesses that were in the vicinity. So the testimony so far and the evidence provided has shown how the police decided from the outset, and this was an audio recording from the police radio, that indicated that as soon as the protests left Logan Circle in D.C., that the police had already decided at that point to do the mass arrest, and that led up to the current situation where there's almost 194 defendants who are still facing trial.
Now, what about the prosecutor's conspiracy claims? Could you talk about how they're alleging that and how the defense is countering that in the trial?
So the prosecutor initially, and this is actually the second superseding indictment. So the third indictment that the defendants are facing in this trial. So the prosecutor amended it twice after the initial indictment in order to have the current charges. And initially, with that indictment, had put out the conspiracy charge as a felony, as well as engaging in a riot as a felony charge. The judge has since ruled that those are actually not even potential felony charges and instead are only misdemeanors. So that dropped the potential time that the defendants were facing from 75 years down to about 60 years, which is currently what most of the defendants are still facing. There is a trial block for December that is scheduled where those defendants had charges dropped down from felonies to only 3 misdemeanors.
I want to bring Elizabeth Legesse into this conversation. You were a part of the protests. Explain why you went out to protest that day, where you came from, and what happened to you.
Yeah, let me first say that just because of the way that our legal system works, the way our criminal system works, I can't actually talk about the events of the protest itself from the moment I arrived to the moment we were arrested. Because of concerns for preserving my Fifth Amendment rights, it's possible that they could force me to testify under certain circumstances. So like most criminal defendants, that's what my lawyer has recommended. I will, however, speak to why I was there. And I was there to express my concern with the way that our political landscape was developing. And I think that a lot of people can sympathize with that motivation.
And can you talk about the ACLU lawsuit that you're a part of? And can you talk about what happened when you were jailed? For example, do you have your cell phone now?
I do not have my cell phone. So the ACLU lawsuit is basically alleging that the police did not handle themselves very well on Inauguration Day, both in the choice to make those arrests and the way that they made those arrests, and then in the way that they treated prisoners after they had been arrested. Basically, everyone was kettled, which is a fairly controversial technique in policing that just really indiscriminately sweeps people up in a way that that troubles civil liberties activists and really anyone who's concerned about making the right choice from an arrest perspective, because people are swept up as a group rather than individually. And on top of that, they left us out on the street for many hours. It was a slow walk arrest. It was cold and rainy. People had no access to bathrooms, food, water, medical care. And then once they had us in custody, various people had really negative experiences with the way the police treated them. And in the process of being arrested, they took everyone's phones. And to this day, as far as I know, none of the defendants have gotten their phones back, which has been a financial hardship and, as you can imagine, a privacy issue.
Well, Jude Ortiz, I'd like to ask you about this phone issue, the seizure of the phones, the efforts that the police made to break into the phones to somehow or other trace back communications of the different protesters, and I guess prove a conspiracy was afoot.
So some of the phones that were seized, like in the kettle, had encryption of various sorts. Some might just be password protection. Some might be full encryption. A lot of phones today come out of the box with full encryption. And so to the best of our knowledge, the government has not been able to get past the encryption technology on phones, but some phones were unlocked. I think it's important to note that many protesters who were arrested did not have phones at all, and that the government has also gone after electronic data in various other ways. So immediately after the mass arrest, the government was, or sent some letters of request or requests to Apple iCloud for user data, and that was for some of the people who were arrested, and at least one person who was associated with one arrestee, but not even present and not part of the case at all.
And were people questioned about the social media that they use?
I'm not aware of any particular questions that were asked by officers, like to protesters or like arrestees directly, but the government has gone after a wide swath of electronic data in this case, including trying to get about 1.3 million IP addresses and identifying information from the web host of disruptj20.org, which was a website that existed prior to the inauguration, as well as trying to get information from Facebook accounts of several activists in the D.C. area, and that was through a search warrant.
And can you talk about the two freelance journalists who were also arrested, Jude? One of them, Alexei Wood, on trial this week, and they are trying to use his video footage in the case against him and the others.
Yeah, so it's Alexei Wood, and he was one of a handful of journalists who were arrested that day. A lot of the journalists who were arrested had charges dropped or were never filed, but Alexei and Aaron Cantu, who is another independent journalist, are still facing charges. They're facing the same charges as everyone else in the case, except for that December group that I mentioned earlier, and so that means that they're facing 60 years. Alexei was out in D.C. on J20 as a freelance journalist who was live streaming the events, and that live stream is available publicly and is being used as evidence, not only in this trial, but the prosecutor has indicated that that will be used as evidence in every trial that's set to happen all the way through 2018.
And it seems like it's really a problem of independent journalists, too, because people associated with major outlets were released or had their charges dropped, but independent journalists have had a harder time with that.
And Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, in many of these mass protest situations, authorities may round up people initially, but then either drop the charges or lower the charges by the time they come to trial. I'm wondering your response to how it appears, at least under President Trump, that the police in Washington are determined to continue to prosecute these allegations and get maximum convictions if possible.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization of the situation. And I don't pretend to be able to read their minds. I don't pretend to be able to tell you exactly what their plan is or why they're doing what they're doing. But it is certainly true that they have worked very hard to pressure people into accepting pleas. They've offered many people various pleas, as little as a single misdemeanor charge. And it really makes it seem like their goal is to get convictions for rioting. And it seems like an unusual coincidence that happens as someone is getting inaugurated who, in some of their first public statements, say things like, you know, we're going to restore the rule of law, so on and so forth. So I think there's likely a connection there, even if it's just as simple as people feeling more emboldened now that that kind of person is in office.
And Jude Ortiz, can you talk about the so-called independent investigation? The city itself, Washington, D.C., hired an organization called the Police Foundation to launch an independent investigation into how the protest was policed. Who are they?
So the Police Foundation is a very biased organization that has been contracted or otherwise brought into the Office of Police Complaints inquiry into police abuses and brutality on Inauguration Day, January 20th. Earlier this year, rather, there was an initial inquiry into allegations of police misconduct and abuse and brutality. And the initial findings indicated that there was the justification for a full investigation, and subsequently $100,000 was earmarked for that investigation. That money became available on October 1st, and so then the investigation has begun. The Police Foundation is the body that is doing that investigation. It's supposedly an unbiased, kind of nonpartisan organization, but its website indicates that it's a very much kind of thin blue line, very, very pro-police organization. And a lot of the statements and other characterizations that it has on its website indicate its extreme bias in favor of the police. That bias obviously calls into question any kind of impartiality or any type of kind of quote-unquote fair investigation into the actions of police that day. And when you have that in conjunction with evidence that's been presented so far at trial that shows the kind of wanton use of pepper spray and projectile weapons, and the police commander saying over the radio as soon as the protests began leaving Logan Circle that the intention was to arrest everyone, with those things kind of in combination, it's very unlikely that there will be actual fair and impartial inquiry and any kind of legitimate findings of actual police abuses and misconduct that day. So
this is the first trial right now. We have 30 seconds, Jude. You call this case the canary in the coal mine. What do you mean?
By that, I meant that the implications for this case and how this trial goes are something that will have echoes all across the country. With that, if the prosecution is successful in calling political organizing and association and resistance to the overt rise of white supremacy and neo-fascism under Trump, then that's something that other prosecutors, other police across the country can try to replicate this prosecutor's attempt to call political organizing conspiracy and threaten people with decades in prison. If people want to find out more, they can go to defendj20resistance.org. And we also have a fundraiser to raise legal support money for the defendants. And that's defendj20resistance.org/donate.
Jude, thanks so much for being with us. Jude Ortiz of Defend J20 and National Lawyers Guild, Elizabeth Legess, a J20 defendant and plaintiff in the ACLU lawsuit. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, floating Guantanamos. Stay with us.
इस शहर में ओ कोई प्यार नहीं इस शहर में oh ain't no love in the heart of the city ain't no love in the heart of town and it sure is a pity. Ain't no love since you ain't around. Oh, since you've been around. Ain't no love in the heart of the city.
Ain't No Love in the Heart of the City by Muslim Indian American singer Zishan B, singing here in our Democracy Now! Studios. To see the full performances and interview, go to democracynow.org. And if you want to sign up for our daily headlines and news alerts, you can just text the word Democracy Now! One word without a space to 66866. That's 66866, the word Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we end today's show with a shocking new expose that reveals how the U.S. Coast Guard is detaining suspected thousands of drug smugglers they arrest in international waters and keeping them jailed at sea for up to several months before they're charged in a U.S. federal court. Many of the suspects are low-level smugglers from impoverished fishing towns in Latin America. During their imprisonment at sea, they are shackled on deck, exposed to the elements, and denied access to lawyers and their families.
The increased detentions began when General John Kelly headed the Pentagon's Southern Command from 2012 to 2016. Kelly is now President Trump's White House Chief of Staff after briefly serving as Homeland Defense Secretary. The report in the New York Times Magazine is headlined, "The Coast Guard's Floating Guantanamos." And for more, we're joined by the journalist who broke the story, Seth Freed Wessler, also a Puffin Fellow at the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute. Welcome to Democracy Now!,
Thanks.
Seth. Floating Guantanamos, describe what they are.
Well, the Coast Guard has been deployed deep into the Pacific Ocean to pick up drugs being moved from South America, Colombia, and Ecuador to Central America, mostly cocaine. And in the process of that interdiction work, they're detaining hundreds of suspected smugglers every year and then chaining those men aboard Coast Guard cutters by short chains around their ankles, chained to the decks of these ships or along the side of these ships, and holding them aboard Coast Guard cutters for weeks or months while the ships continue their drug interdiction patrols, and eventually transferring these men back to the United States to face prosecution here. The numbers of detainees over the last 6 years have increased dramatically, and even more dramatically, the numbers of people being prosecuted criminally in the United States for this activity that's happening in international waters, often aboard foreign flagged ships, has increased dramatically. This past year, 700 men were detained aboard these boats, and I spent a good part of the last year talking to many of these men, talking to Coast Guard officials, and trying to figure out what's happening on these ships.
Now Seth, is there a presidential executive order, or how was the policy developed to allow the Coast Guard to go so far afield from the U.S. coast?
Well, the Coast Guard has long been sort of in the business of interdicting contraband, right? It's the only branch of the U.S. military that's also a law enforcement agency. For its several hundred-year history, it's engaged in this sort of drug interdiction work. What changed in the 80s was that for the first time, the act of smuggling drugs in international waters became a U.S. crime. And then in 2012, Southern Command, the Department of Defense, launched a program called Operation Martillo to shut down smuggling routes between South America
Martillo
and Central.
Is Spanish for hammer.
For hammer, that's right. So to shut down the smuggling route in the transit zone. And what really shifted is that we sort of started to flood the Pacific with Coast Guard ships and began to prosecute nearly everybody we picked up rather than returning them to their countries or to Central American countries for prosecution.
So tell us about the man you profiled, Johnny Arsentales. Tell us what happened the night he was taken, where he's from, and what's happened to him.
So Mr. Arsentales is a fisherman from the central coast of Ecuador. He's been a fisherman for more than 20 years. He came on sort of hard times and made a fairly rash decision to take a drug smuggling job, moving cocaine off of the northern coast of Ecuador to Central America. On that trip, this 1,000-mile trip, he was spotted by a U.S. Navy airplane that flew off of a Central American base. Interdicted, picked up by the Coast Guard, and then brought aboard a Coast Guard cutter. And he and the 6 other men he was smuggling drugs with were held for 70 days aboard a series of Coast Guard and Navy ships until eventually they were transferred to the U.S. and prosecuted criminally. While they were aboard these ships, they were shackled at all times except for a moment to be brought to the toilet, which was actually often a bucket on the deck of the ship. They described this sort of terror of not knowing where they would be taken. They weren't allowed to call their families. They weren't provided attorneys while they were on board these ships. They weren't put in contact with their consulates. They were essentially just held.
Their families thought they were dead?
So in many of these cases, these families, their relatives really believed them to be dead. In one case, a Guatemalan man I spoke with, his family actually held a funeral for him, expecting that he had died. Fishermen disappear at sea. That's a thing that happens. They assumed that they would be receiving a waterlogged body back in their town. Instead, they got a call more than 70 days later from, in the case of Johnny Arsentales, from a Florida jail saying that he had been brought to the United States.
Now, you mentioned that they're not given any legal representation or read Miranda rights and so forth, but what about the issue that if the Coast Guard is arresting people that they know are from other countries, they have some responsibility to the governments of these countries to notify them that they're seizing their subjects?
Well, the U.S. is notifying the countries that the boats are registered to. So in this case, the United States contacted Guatemala, where the boat that Johnny Arsentales was aboard was registered. Guatemala gave the U.S. permission to board and detain the men on this ship, on this speedboat. There were 7 men in this group of people. Several of them were Guatemalan, several were Ecuadorian, and one was Colombian. They were all brought to the United States after Guatemala signed off. The U.S. Has agreements with dozens of Central and South American countries to facilitate this boarding process, and as a result has been able to prosecute hundreds of people every year in U.S. court for this activity that's happening in the sort of legal gray zone of international waters.
Which U.S. court do they bring them to?
They bring nearly all of these men to Florida, to courts in the 11th Circuit in Florida, because the 11th Circuit prosecutors and judges there have experience in these cases. There are task forces set up in Florida to take on drugs, and because the 9th Circuit, the California courts, have actually put some restrictions on the kinds of cases that can be prosecuted. And so instead of moving people up the West Coast to San Diego, which would often be much easier, these men are held aboard these cutters and then either brought through the Panama Canal or flown from Central America to Florida.
John Kelly, his involvement, now the chief of staff of President Trump.
Right. So John Kelly, between 2012 and 2016, was the head of Southern Command, which
under Obama.
Under the Obama administration. The Southern Command is responsible for sort of managing the U.S. war on drugs in Latin America. And under his command, the numbers of people detained by the Coast Guard, which is formerly under the Department of Homeland Security, the number of people detained by the Coast Guard grew dramatically, and even more dramatically, the number of people prosecuted started to spike. Kelly has long been a proponent of this idea that to keep the U.S. safe, we need to push our border outward. We need to operate law enforcement and military activity far, far away from the borders. And that's really been the strategy that the Coast Guard has been pulled into.
We have 10 seconds.
To operate deep into the Pacific, sometimes thousands of miles from the U.S., and hold people aboard these cutters in the meantime for weeks or months at a time.
John Kelly expanded this program.
It was under his watch at Southern Command that this program grew.
We're going to leave it there, but we'll continue to pursue this story. Seth Freed-Wessler will link to your story in the New York Times Magazine. Headline, The Coast Guard's Floating Guantanamos. Democracy Now! Produced by Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wells, Laura Gaddis, Sam Alkoff. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.